Hello and welcome to Baiju's IAS. Let's begin today's session of the Hindu's comprehensive news analysis with the first article here that talks about India's disappointing human rights record and how our warm relationship with the US has helped India hide that record at the global stage. The author here, who is a former Foreign Secretary of India, says that India has not been able to improve on its human rights record as per multiple indices released at the global stage. For example, last year, India was ranked at 142nd position at the World Press Freedom Index. Apart from this, the US State Department's country report on human rights itself said that significant human rights issues are in India, including extrajudicial killings, torture, arbitrary arrest, etc. However, despite all these glaring errors, the US has not stopped embracing India and offering India continuous support in most sectors as required by India. The author here says that the Prime Minister, to his credit, has been successful in forging a great relationship with the new US President after the departure of Donald Trump. US considers India as an extremely critical ally and is the only designated major defense partner of the US. Multiple US leaders in their parliament have repeatedly said that India is extremely critical to America's security interest. The US, in fact, did not even force India to pull out of the S 400 missile deal that India has recently concluded with Russia, which again highlights the fact that the US has been offering a lot of leverage to the Indian government of late. The US treatment towards India is now very similar to the US treatment towards Israel. Despite most of the world's nations pointing out towards Israel's bad human rights record, towards Israel's violations of international law, the US has always stood by Israel time and time again. And the author says that India also finds itself in a similar situation with Washington embracing India despite its dismal human rights record over the past few years. Now, why exactly has this happened? The author here says that even today, most of the world's big media houses are the ones that are situated in the Western nations. In effect, the US government indirectly controls a lot of media houses. As a result of which, even the smallest of news is covered in Australia, Africa, but even when there are major issues in India where the government is at fault, the international media does not give it the kind of coverage that it deserves. For example, as the author says, 6 people dying in Australia because of wind may be covered in the international news. On the other hand, an Indian woman committing suicide every 25 minutes is never covered in the global media. Thus, as per the author, American government and most of the other Western countries have different standards for different nations. Thus, that this time it is working in India's favor. He also gives an example of what is happening in China right now. As you know, China is about to host the Winter Olympics. The US and then some of the other Western nations recently said that their officials will boycott the Winter Olympics in China because of the human rights record of China in the Xinjiang region. However, none of these nations have said anything against Qatar that is about to host the upcoming Football World Cup. Qatar, on the other hand, has a dismal human rights record. It is common knowledge that they don't give proper rights to their workers. Even the concept of homosexuality is deemed illegal in Qatar. Even then, none of the Western nations, including the US, has said anything against Qatar, which points out towards different parameters through which different countries are seen. We recently saw the US government even imposing sanctions on Bangladesh's force, saying that they are violating human rights, but the same kind of sanctions are not seen when it comes to other nations with which the US or the European nations want to have better relations. However, this should not encourage India not to work on its human rights record. At the end of the day, if we want to project ourselves as a world leader where the other countries can look up to, we must first look inwards and work on our own shortcomings. There have been multiple reports by different authorities pointing out towards where exactly is the Indian government lacking, and we can't dismiss all those reports just by calling them anti-national or saying that they have their own interests. It is also important to note how exactly did the concept of human rights begin in the world and what is the status of human rights in India. The concept of human rights came up specifically after the Second World War. Just a few years after the UN came into being, in 1948 December, the UN General Assembly adopted what we call as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that is UDHR. This established a common set of basic values which are regarded throughout the world as human rights. Human rights are the rights that you get just by virtue of being a human being. You don't have to be of any specific nation for that. You don't have to be of any specific age or religion or color for that. Just because you are a human, you deserve certain rights. That is what is called as human rights. These include the right to life and liberty, right to freedom from slavery, torture, right to freedom of expression, etc. These include a total of 30 rights, which include a lot of civil and political rights as well. Do note that the UDHR is no treaty and thus it is not legally binding on the nations to accept this. But it just sets an international standard for the governments to follow preferably. Along with the UDHR, we also have International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and some other optional protocols which many nations around the world today follow. The United Nations also has a Human Rights Council, which is an intergovernmental body within the UN and is responsible for strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights. It has 47 member states which are elected by the UN General Assembly. They hold a periodic review of the human rights across the world and once every 4 years review the human rights record of 192 UN member states. In India, while our constitution does not make a specific mention of human rights, what we have done is we have enlisted few fundamental rights for the people, which are very similar to the concept of human rights. However, to be in line with the global standard and with the other nations in the world, in 1993, the Indian government established the National Human Rights Commission and respective state human rights commissions as statutory bodies for protection of human rights for people across the country. You would have read about these bodies in your polity classes. The next article that we have talks about the need to have proper safety protocols in place specifically for the fireworks industry. If you have ever burnt a firecracker in India, I'm sure you would have heard about a place called Sevakasi. It's a very small place in Tamil Nadu which accounts for over 90% of the firecrackers that are made in India. Unfortunately, this place is also very familiar with unfortunate incidents in the firework manufacturing workshops. Recently, four workers unfortunately lost their lives on the New Year's Day on a blast at a unit which took place in the Virudnagar district. Sivakasi is situated within the Virudnagar district itself. This was not the first such incident. Just in 2021, in the month of February, there were multiple workers who lost their life because of a similar blast that took place in a firework unit. Since these are so common, you would expect that the government would have taken some strict action and safety protocols would have been in place to prevent such things from happening again. Sadly, that is not the case. The blast that happened now was because of the mishandling of chemicals. In the past, also, multiple committees have been made to prevent such incidents, and the fact is that the situation in the firework industry, specifically in Tamil Nadu, has improved drastically. If you look at these industries about 2 or 3 decades back, there was a lot of child labor that was involved in these industries. However, after the government intervention, at least the proportion of child labor has reduced drastically. However, there are still lack of provisions about the safety and handling of chemicals in these industries. This is what this article points towards. That it is now time for us to strictly look at the important safety protocols needed to safeguard the workers working in these industries. The firework industry specifically holds a lot of economic importance in the state of Tamil Nadu. It is concentrated in an area of the state which does not have a lot of irrigation. Thus, people can't depend on agriculture. In fact, the firework industry in India is about a 6,000 crore industry and gives employment to lakhs of people in the state of Tamil Nadu. As I said earlier, in the past also, multiple such unfortunate events have occurred, and we have seen various committees being made to investigate the matter. The last such incident took place in February 2021, after which an 8 member committee was made by the National Green Tribunal. The committee suggested that the Explosives Act should be amended to make punishments more stringent than what they are right now, and only certified people should be allowed to operate in areas of mixing and filling of chemicals and making of color palettes. Apart from which, drones must also be used by the authorities for surveillance of such units and not just infrequent inspections. Now, since these unfortunate events have become more and more frequent over the past few years, it is also important for us to look at the reasons behind such problems in the state of Tamil Nadu. Although these incidents have become common, the government, either at the center or at the state level, have not been able to arrive at a concrete solution. Usually, we only see short term actions being taken after such incidents. For example, there is registration and identification of cases. A few people are arrested who are related to the accident. There are symbolic inspections for the next few months, and warning and safety advisories are issued. However, when a few months pass on, everything is forgotten and we are back to the old ways of working. Why exactly do these such incidents occur? Number one, there is a large scale illegal subleasing of workers for licensed firework industry. So in a firework industry, ideally only trained and licensed professionals are allowed to work. However, they come at a higher wage. Thus, the people who are running these factories and workshops employ workers who are not really experts in handling these chemicals just to save out on their cost. Second, there's a violation on the limit of workers that can be employed, because as a owner of the workshop you want as much protection as possible, which leads to crowding of each shed. Thirdly, in most of these factories there is a piece rate system, meaning that the more pieces a worker produces, more money is given to him. Thus the workers are tempted to produce more and more units every single day, and thus finishing their work in as little time as possible, which can also cause such accidents. Fourth, there is a lack of trained workers who can manage chemicals in a better way. And fifth, a lot of these units do not have the appropriate licenses from the government. Such units require licenses from the government authorities, but there is mushrooming of such units who have a nexus with the government officials, and whenever someone comes to inspect, they make some arrangements in a financial transaction and make sure that their unit continues to run without any licenses. All of these make up a perfect recipe for the next disaster coming up very soon. The next article here focuses on the government's alleged inability to protect the minorities in the country as they had promised earlier. The author here says that the current government is specially too lax on cases which involve threats to minorities, and the specific IPC sections which have been made to promote religious tolerance in India have been underutilized by this government. The author here says that Prime Minister Vajpayee had assured the nations after multiple rights that we will still follow the old age traditions of religious tolerance in India, that India will always be in line with the International Human Rights Convention that we had just discussed in the earlier articles. Not just this, our fundamental rights, directive principles, fundamental duties, all of these in some way or the other talk about religious tolerance and underline the government's duty to ensure that this diversity of India lives long. But the author says in the past few years, the government has not done their own bit to protect the people of religious and linguistic minorities, as we have seen across the country. And the problem here is not that we don't have enough laws. The author here says that the Indian Penal Code has a full fledged chapter on offences related to religion. It also has penalties for outraging religious feelings, insulting other beliefs. However, these provisions are almost never enforced despite the violations happening out in the open, with speeches going online covered by televisions, newspapers, etc. The author here indirectly is pointing towards a recently held religious congregation where the people of the minority community were threatened, despite which no action was taken against the people involved. The article also says that we have the Representation of People Act 1951 that declares that promoting or attempting to promote feelings of enmity or hatred between the classes of citizens is a punishable offense. But still, we don't see any such actions, even though the people who are involved are repeat offenders. The famous Supreme Court Justice Sri V.R. Krishna Iyer had one observed It is a matter of profound regret that political communalism is foliating and flourishing largely because parties and politicians have not the will, professions apart, to give up the chase for power through politicizing communal identity. The importance of upholding the secular nature of India has been underlined by the Supreme Court in multiple cases, including the Ahmedabad St. Xavier's College case of 1974, the S.R. Bomai case, and many such cases. The Supreme Court has declared that secularism is a positive concept of equal treatment of all religions in India. Thus, irrespective of how many people have adopted a specific religion in a country, the government must give equal respect to all of those and ensure that the minority is safeguarded from the whims and fancies of the majority population. As per the author, the government would do well either to look back at its own tall leader, that is Atal Bihari Vajpayee, or go back to the Supreme Court's judgments about the concept of secularism and the need for the government to ensure that secular nature of India is safeguarded. Now, we talk a lot about the concept of minorities in India, but the interesting part is that the Constitution of India has not defined the word minority. Although the word minority has been used multiple times in the Constitution, the only definition of minorities that we have in India is given by the National Commission for Minorities Act 1992 in Section 2C. It says that minority will be a community as notified by the central government. So in India, this applies to Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Parsis, and Jain religions. As per the Supreme Court in the TMA Pai Foundation case, a minority, either a linguistic or a religious minority, shall be determined at the state level and not at the central level. Meaning that, for instance, in the Union Territory of Lakshadweep, the Muslims are not a minority. Same with Jammu and Kashmir, the Muslims are not a minority. In Punjab, Sikhs are not a minority. So, as per the Supreme Court, the minority definition can be altered state by state and does not have to be on an all India basis. The constitution makers also realized the importance of ensuring that safeguards are provided to minorities in the country. And that is why the constitution has several provisions for ensuring protection to minorities in India. It includes Article 15, 16, 25, 28, Article 30, subsection 1, subsection 2, and many other provisions later passed by the Parliament, including the Constitution of National Commission for Minorities in India. The next article that we have talks about the role played by the NGOs in ensuring sustainable development of the country. The author here says that in a country of India's scale and size, it is not possible for the government alone to ensure that development reaches till the last possible person. Thus, the government must also take help of the non-government sector and ensure that the fruits of development reach as many people as possible. We have seen multiple examples, especially in the rural areas, how NGOs and other organizations which are not related to the government have played a major role in skill development, in educating the people, and making them realize their rights to live a better life. The previous governments, realizing the fact that the NGOs require substantial amount of financial resources to work, had made certain changes in the Companies Act. For instance, the Section 135 of the Companies Act mandates that the corporates who are earning profits above a certain level must pay at least 2% of their profit before tax to the development space. This is called CSR, which stands for Corporate Social Responsibility, which means that it is the responsibility of the corporates to give back to the society. Not just in development, the non-state actors such as NGOs also play a major role in holding the government accountable. They educate the people about asking questions to the government, about asking for their rights that they correctly deserve from the government. Let me give you an example. Let's assume the government decides that we will have to build a big dam for hydroelectric purposes. Now, when you build such a big infrastructure, such as a dam, you would need to displace thousands of people who are living in that area. Let's assume the government goes to 5 villages, tells the people that you have to go away from here, we have to build a dam, we will compensate for your land, and we will give each one of your family rupees 5 lakh. Now, let's assume an NGO comes here and tells the people that 5 lakh is too less. You should demand the government at least 50 lakh, because in 5 lakh you will not be able to buy any other house. These people obviously would want more money, so they believe with the NGO. The NGO tells them, don't worry, we will fight on your behalf. We will invite the media. We will not let the government go ahead with the project. Now the problem starts. The government says that these NGOs are not allowing the country to develop. The NGOs, on the other hand, say that the government is not giving their enough rights to the people. This is when the government at many times comes face to face with the NGOs and don't want them to work. This is what has been happening in the past few years as per the author. The author here says that any NGO that takes a stand against the government or that encourages people to ask questions to the government is termed as anti-national by the government. The NGOs which are getting funds from abroad, especially, are the ones that are targeted by the government. In the past few years, you would have seen a lot of NGOs have been banned in India, with the government saying that they are against India's development and are getting funds from outside India, especially to stall India's developmental efforts. While this might be true to a certain extent, but in reality, ideally, you want a balance between the two. You can't just directly ban thousands of NGOs because they were speaking against the government or a government project. The government has also, over the past few years, tried to cut down on the funding that the NGOs get through CSR, which has stifled the growth of the NGO sector in India, as per the author, which is a negative sign. Let's look a bit closely about how do the NGOs work in India and from where do they get their money. As we discussed, the concept of CSR is a part of Companies Act in India. India, in fact, is the first country in the world to mandate CSR spending to identify potential CSR activities. This law applies to companies having an annual turnover of rupees 1000 crore or more, or having a net worth of 500 crore or more, or having a net profit of 5 crores or more. These companies mandatorily have to spend 2% of their average net profit in the previous 3 years on CSR activities. It is the government that decides which activities can be called CSR activities. These include education, health related activities. These also include spending on certain government schemes, etc. In 2018, a high level committee was made by the government on CSR called the Injeti Srinivas Committee. This committee said that CSR expenditure should be tax deductible and the unspent balance in the CSR activities should be carried forward for 3 to 5 years. Not just this, the spending on CSR should be in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals that we must achieve by 2030. During the ongoing pandemic, the Government of India also made a slight change in the CSR activities. That is, the government allowed the companies to spend CSR funds on COVID 19 relief, such as preventive healthcare and sanitation, and on research and development of COVID drugs and vaccines. Apart from such corporates, many NGOs also get funding from foreign nations. To regulate that funding, we have two significant laws in India. And I am sure all of you would have heard about these laws. First is the FCRA, that is the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act of 2010. This law is implemented by the Ministry of Home Affairs and makes sure that the recipient of foreign contributions spend that money for the specified purpose only. So if you are an NGO that got funds promising that you will sponsor education of 5,000 kids and someone gave you 50 crore rupees from the US, this law ensures that this money is spent for the said purpose only and not for something else. NGOs under this act have to register themselves every 5 years and give a report about their expenditure. Next, we also have the FEMA law, that is Foreign Exchange Management Act, which aims to consolidate and amend the law relating to foreign exchange in order to ensure that external trade and payment is facilitated in the country. In 2016, the Ministry of Finance was given the power to monitor NGOs who are placed under this particular law. The idea was that NGOs that receive foreign donations should all be covered under one single umbrella. Thus, all the NGOs receiving foreign funds will be regulated by one single custodian under this particular law. The next article talks about the Russia Ukraine situation and where do we stand right now. We have discussed this issue multiple times in the past in the CNAs and in the daily quiz as well. This article tries to give you a summarized version of what the current status is between Ukraine and Russia. As per the recent news reports, Russia has positioned almost 1 lakh troops at its border with Ukraine that wants to become a NATO member as soon as possible. While the US and other Western countries have forced Russia not to take any further action and not to invade Ukraine, Russia says that its intention is not to invade Ukraine but to safeguard its own rights and interests. Now, what exactly is it that the Russian government is demanding? And what is the point of view of the Western nations? So, Russia is demanding a few things one by one. First, Russia says that NATO should withdraw their troops and weapons from all the countries in Europe that joined NATO after 1997. After 1997 means those nations which were earlier a part of the Soviet Union, but then later on they went on to join NATO. So Russia says that NATO should not operate in Eastern European countries such as Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Why? Because they have a common border with Russia. Apart from this, they should not even have their weapons in Poland, Hungary. Why? Because they are very close to Russia. Not just this, NATO should not enlarge its size. Thus, Ukraine, Georgia, which again are neighbors of Russia, should not be made a part of NATO. NATO should also not hold drills in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Georgia. So it's a big list of demands that Russia has from NATO, America, and Europe. West, on the other hand, obviously does not accept any of these demands. They say that this is unrealistic. Every single country, including Ukraine, is sovereign and are free to take its own decisions. Who is Russia to decide who will join NATO or not? Who is Russia to decide where will NATO place its weapons? And who is Russia to decide whether or not NATO can have its military activities in some other friendly country or not? Thus, it is kind of a stalemate between the two sides. Now, one other angle to this dispute is between Russia and Germany and a gas pipeline called the Nord Stream 2. This is a gas pipeline that connects Russia to Germany. Now, why is it significant? Germany, anyway, buys a lot of gas from Russia, but this particular pipeline will double the volume of gas that is supplied from Russia to Germany. Now, if you look at Germany, the country has been very keen on cutting down the use of coal and nuclear energy and wants cheap gas from Russia. In fact, Angela Merkel, when she was a chancellor, had tried to expedite this particular pipeline and the deal with Russia. But the problem is now there is a new government in Germany. It's a coalition government, and in a coalition government, you have to take decisions after talking to every single partner. One of the parties who are involved in the German coalition is the Green Party. Germany's vice chancellor right now, who is from the Green Party, has said that the pipeline right now is a mistake from a geopolitical perspective, and if Russia takes any action against Ukraine, we will not start the functioning of the pipeline. It is important to note that the pipeline construction is complete. They are just awaiting certain permissions from the authorities. The US also has said that if Russia takes any action against Ukraine, they will put sanctions on this particular pipeline. Interestingly, the pipeline is as important to Russia as it is to Germany. While Russia will earn a lot more money through this pipeline by supplying more gas to Germany, Germany, on the other hand, will meet its goal of cutting down on the use of coal and nuclear power since it will get much cleaner gas from Russia. The next step is that on the 10th of January, senior officials from Russia and the US will meet to try and de escalate the situation. But till then, we'll only have to wait and see what happens next in this particular scenario. Now, this is not the first time that there's a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The history between the two sides and their conflict is pretty old. Ukraine was in fact a part of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union group, after Russia, Ukraine was a larger state. In fact, even today in Ukraine, a lot of people who live there are of Russian ethnicity and Russian background. The location of Ukraine is what makes it interesting. It is seen as a buffer state between Russia and Europe, And thus both Russia and Western nations have been trying to have as much influence over Ukraine as possible. So it is kind of stuck between the two. The problem between Russia and Ukraine recently started in 2013. In 2013, the Ukraine government, which was considered to be closer to Russia, decided to suspend signing of an agreement with the European Union and instead chose to have closer ties with Russia. This angered a lot of people in Ukraine because in Ukraine, most people think that their economic development will only happen if they come close to Europe. They see Russia as a much bigger power who is trying to control them. So most people in Ukraine have been trying to forge much better relationship with the Western nations, with Western Europe, US, etc. In 2013, when the government did something against the wishes of the people, it led to a lot of protest and a change in the government. This led to Russia asserting its authority and seizing the area of Crimea from Ukraine. Crimea was a part of Ukraine but was forcibly annexed by Russia. This also led to a lot of sanctions on Russia by European nations and the US. This was the first time that a European country had annexed territory from another European country after World War II. Ukraine since then has been urging that it wants to be a part of NATO as soon as possible. Now remember, NATO works on a concept that an attack against any one of us is an attack against every one of us. So essentially, after Ukraine becomes a NATO member, and if then Ukraine is attacked by Russia, all the NATO members will have the responsibility together to safeguard Ukraine and to launch an attack collectively on Russia, which can become a major matter. That is why the nations across the world want to de escalate the issue. Now, in 2014, when the Crimea annexation took place by the hands of Russia, there were two agreements signed after that. Both these were called Minsk agreements. The first one was signed in 2014 September that led to a ceasefire between the two sides. However, the agreement broke down quickly after a lot of violations from both the sides. In 2015, another agreement was signed by the same name called Minsk II, in which France and Germany came as mediators to get the agreement signed between Ukraine and Russia. Remember, Russia says that we were not fighting Ukraine at that point of time. They were rebels who were fighting the Ukraine government. But the reality is that these rebels who were fighting the Ukraine government were getting all the support and funding from Russia only and no one else. These are all the articles from the Hindu newspaper that we wanted to discuss today. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, given the size and diversity of India, we need a robust presence of NGOs and cooperatives to ensure last mile delivery of basic amenities in the country. Do you agree? Give arguments to support your stance. Second, enlist the initiatives taken by the government thus far to protect the human rights of people in India. Also, evaluate the performance of such initiatives. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.